The grand ballroom of the Astoria shimmered, a sea of liquid gold and diamond-hard light. It was a gilded cage built for the gods of this city, and tonight, its king was holding court. On a raised platform, Ethan Thorne, the 30-something wunderkind CEO of Thorne Innovations, lifted a crystal flute of champagne. A self-made orphan prodigy, he had spun lines of code into a multi-billion-dollar empire, and the smile that played on his lips was as sharp and brilliant as the cut of his suit. He was about to deliver a historic toast, a promise of a future he had single-handedly architected. But amidst the perfectly choreographed ballet of servers, one young woman, Sarah Miller, felt a cold dread clamp around her heart. Her hand, clad in a pristine white service glove, trembled almost imperceptibly. Her gaze was fixed on him, not with the practiced deference of a waitress, but with a raw, desperate urgency. One hand instinctively began to lift, a silent, useless gesture, as if she could physically halt the words forming on his lips, stop the deadly liquid from touching them. Her face, usually a polite and forgettable mask, was a canvas of pure, undiluted fear. This was the moment, a silent, shattering plea suspended between two worlds, a whisper of terror in a room roaring with success. But that moment of silent, desperate terror was not the beginning. It was the culmination. The real story, the one hidden beneath the starched linen and polished silver, began 3 weeks earlier, in a world that glittered with nothing but grit and hope. 3 weeks prior, Sarah's life was an endless, exhausting loop of shifts. Her universe was not a grand ballroom, but a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, a place where the scent of her neighbor's cooking mingled with the faint, persistent smell of damp from a leaky pipe she could never afford to fix. The apartment's chipped paint and worn floorboards were a constant reminder of how close to the edge they lived. But it was also a sanctuary, a world that held the only thing that mattered, her 9-year-old sister, Maya. That evening, Sarah had come home late. The familiar ache settled deep in her bones. She found Maya asleep at their small kitchen table, her head resting on a half-finished drawing. A crayon had rolled from her limp fingers, leaving a bright blue streak across the page. In the drawing, 2 figures held hands under a ridiculously large, smiling sun. One was tall, with brown hair like Sarah's. The other was a small, vibrant explosion of color, her head a halo of curly black scribbles, just like Maya's. Sarah's heart constricted with a love so fierce it was almost painful. She gently lifted her sister, whose small body was a feather-light weight in her arms, and carried her to the single bed they shared. As she tucked the worn blanket around Maya's shoulders, her eyes fell on the stack of envelopes on the counter. The red ink of a past-due notice on the electric bill screamed at her. The rent was due next week. Maya needed new shoes. The list was a relentless beast, always growing, always hungry. Sarah was 24, but she felt 100. She worked double shifts at a diner during the week and took on extra catering gigs on the weekends, like the one tonight at the Astoria for Thorne Innovations. Every dollar was a small victory. Another day they could keep their fragile world from shattering. Sarah looked at her sister's sleeping face, a fierce wave of protectiveness washing over her. It's a feeling so many of us know, that promise to do anything for the ones we love, to stand between them and the harshness of the world. If you feel that same fire in your heart for Sarah and Maya, take a second to hit that like button and let us know you're with them on this journey. The Thorne Innovations Gala was supposed to be just another gig, another fatiguing night of smiling and serving, of being present but invisible. It was a chance to earn in one night what took her 3 days at the diner. She moved through the glittering crowd with practiced ease, her tray a steady extension of her arm. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and murmured, "Excuse me," 1,000 times, her face a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. To these people, she was part of the decor, a functional ghost in a crisp black and white uniform, and it was this invisibility that allowed her to hear it. She had slipped into a secluded service corridor behind the main stage to grab a fresh stack of napkins. The air was cooler there, the roar of the party muted to a low hum. 2 men stood in the shadows near a fire exit, their voices low and sharp, believing themselves to be alone. They were board members. Sarah recognized their faces from the pre-event briefing photos. One was Harrison Vance, a man with silver hair and a predatory stillness. The other was a younger, nervous-looking man named Peterson. "Everything is in place," Vance murmured, his voice a venomous whisper. "The transfer is complete. Once he drinks, it's over." Peterson shifted his weight, his hands fidgeting with his cufflinks. "Are you sure? The toxicology reports, they won't trace it?" Vance let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It's untraceable. A custom compound. It will look like a sudden, tragic cardiac event. A young genius burned out too soon. The press will eat it up. By morning, the board will have invoked the succession clause, and I will be interim CEO. By the time anyone thinks to question the accounts, we'll be untouchable." Sarah froze, her entire body turning to ice. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, choked sound she desperately suppressed. They were talking about Ethan Thorne. "And the glass?" Peterson asked, his voice strained. "How do you know it will be his?" "Because," Vance said, a cruel smile touching his lips, "I will hand it to him myself. The celebratory toast, a moment of triumph. Quite poetic, don't you think? He discovered our little side project a bit too early. Tonight we silence that discovery. Permanently." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Tonight. The glass. He discovered. The fragments slammed together in her mind, forming a picture of such cold, calculated evil that she felt sick. These men, dressed in $1,000 suits and sipping vintage champagne, were planning a murder as calmly as they would a corporate merger. Her first instinct was primal. Run. Flee this place of glittering monsters, get back to her apartment, lock the door, and hold Maya tight. What could she do? She was a waitress, a nobody. Accusing men like that would get her fired, blacklisted, or worse. They would crush her without a second thought. She was an insect to them. The image of Maya's sleeping face flashed in her mind, her innocent trust, her complete dependence. If Sarah got involved, if something happened to her, what would happen to Maya? Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. She could just walk away. Forget what she heard. Disappear back into the crowd and let fate run its course. It wasn't her fight. Ethan Thorne was a billionaire, a man from another planet. His life had nothing to do with hers. But then another image rose in her mind. Ethan Thorne on the stage, his eyes alight with passion as he spoke about the future, about innovation, about creating something that would last. He was a person. A man who was about to drink from a poisoned glass, his life extinguished for money. And she, Sarah Miller, a waitress from Brooklyn, was the only person in this entire opulent room who knew it. A different kind of fire began to burn through the ice in her veins. It was a quiet, stubborn flame of decency that her mother had instilled in her before she passed away. "You always have a choice, Sarah," her mother used to say, "even when you think you don't." She had a choice. She could be invisible and safe, or she could be a human being and risk everything. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. Her mind raced, searching for a plan, any plan. She couldn't scream, she couldn't run to security. Vance was a board member, who would they believe? She had no power, no voice, no weapon but the terrible truth she now carried. And as Ethan Thorne's voice began to echo through the ballroom, his lips forming the first words of his final toast, his hand reaching for the flute that Vance had just placed beside him on the lectern, Sarah knew she had only seconds to stop a murder in front of 500 witnesses. Sarah's hands trembled, but it was a vibration born of adrenaline, not weakness. In her mind's eye, a single, unwavering image burned bright against the encroaching darkness of her fear. Maya, her 9-year-old sister, sitting at their small kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration over a page of math homework. Maya's world was small, contained within the 4 walls of their cramped Brooklyn apartment and the boundaries of her own fierce, bright imagination. It was a world Sarah had sworn to protect with every fiber of her being, with every exhausting double shift, with every dollar scraped together for rent and groceries. That image, that sacred promise, was an anchor in the storm of panic rising in her chest. The whispers she'd overheard weren't just a threat to a stranger in a $1,000 suit. They were a threat to Maya's world. If something happened here, if she was implicated or worse, ignored it, and was later discovered, her job would be the least of what she'd lose. But to stand by and watch a man die, That was a line her soul would not let her cross. The resolve solidified within her, turning the trembling in her hands into a tool of focused intent. She moved through the glittering archipelago of tables, a ghost in a black and white uniform. Her steps were practiced, economical, honed by years of navigating crowded rooms without disturbing the delicate ecosystem of wealth and power. She picked up an empty water pitcher from a service stand, the cool, heavy glass a grounding weight in her palm. Her target was Ethan Thorne's table, a constellation of the most influential figures in the room. Her heart hammered a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat only she could hear. One chance. She had one chance to make this look like an accident. As she approached, she focused on a point just beyond Ethan's shoulder, her eyes tracing the path she would take. She saw the minute space between the chair of a board member and the edge of the table. It was impossibly small, but it would have to be enough. If you've ever felt invisible, you know that the world grants you certain advantages. People don't see you coming. They don't register your presence until you are part of their immediate need. Sarah was counting on that invisibility now more than ever. Taking a final, steadying breath, she moved. Her stumble was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Her ankle twisted just so, her body lurching forward with a small stifled gasp that was perfectly pitched to draw attention without causing alarm. The water pitcher tilted, and a clear, silent arc of water splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, creating a dark, spreading stain inches from Ethan's bespoke suit. The effect was instantaneous, a minor disruption in a flawless evening. A board member recoiled slightly. Another let out a sigh of mild annoyance. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. So clumsy of me," Sarah breathed, her voice a cocktail of mortification and deference. She leaned in close, dabbing at the spill with a cloth, her body creating a brief private shield around him. It was the perfect cover. In that single, fluid motion, as her right hand frantically worked on the stain, her left clutching the folded napkin, moved with the speed of a hummingbird's wing. It slid beneath the lip of the table, her fingers finding the back of Ethan Thorne's hand, where it rested on his thigh. The contact was electric, a spark of desperate human connection in a room of cold transactions. She pressed the small, square note into his palm, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second before retreating. Ethan, who had been in the middle of a sentence about quarterly growth projections, felt the unexpected coolness of her fingers and then the crisp, foreign object being pressed into his hand. His mind, a machine trained to process terabytes of data, lagged for a nanosecond, caught off guard by the unplanned physical contact. He glanced down. The stark black ink on the cheap paper was like a glitch in the opulent code of the evening. 4 words. "Don't drink it. Go now." The world did not freeze. It warped. The gentle, effervescent bubbles rising in the champagne flute before him suddenly seemed sinister, tiny orbs of poison dancing in the light. The practiced smile on the face of his chief financial officer, Marcus Vance, a man he'd known for a decade, seemed to stretch into a predatory grin. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and success, suddenly felt thin, suffocating. A cold dread, colder than any Manhattan winter, slithered down his spine. This was not a prank. The terror in the waitress's eyes had been too real, too raw. He was a target, here, now. Panic, hot and sharp, threatened to rise in his throat, but years of high-stakes negotiations and hostile takeovers had forged an iron will within him. He suppressed it, burying the fear beneath a lifetime of practiced control. He looked up at Sarah, who was still dabbing at the water, her face a perfect mask of professional apology. He gave her a smile, the dazzling, disarming smile that had won over investors and reporters, the one that could hide an abyss. He gently placed the untouched champagne flute back on the table, the crystal making a soft, final click against the wood. The sound was a period at the end of a chapter of his life. He turned his body slightly towards Sarah, his movement appearing as a casual gesture of reassurance. His voice was a low, smooth murmur, a private command that cut through the noise of the ballroom, but was meant only for her. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. It was an edict born of pure survival instinct. Sarah straightened up, her eyes wide, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Ethan rose from his chair, placing a hand on the shoulder of his COO. "Apologies, gentlemen. A small, urgent matter to attend to. I'll be right back for that toast." The lie was smooth, effortless. He walked away from the table, not towards the main exit, but towards a discreet door marked "Staff Only," his stride confident, unhurried. Sarah fell into step just behind him, her phantom-like presence now a shield. The moment the door closed behind them, the world transformed. The muffled symphony of clinking glasses and polite laughter was instantly replaced by the harsh, fluorescent hum of a service corridor. The plush, patterned carpet gave way to cold, unforgiving concrete. Gilded walls were replaced by exposed pipes and cinder blocks. It was a journey from one reality to another, a brutal and immediate stripping away of illusion. The air here smelled of bleach and cooking grease, the unglamorous fuel that kept the machine of opulence running. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. Ethan led the way, navigating the labyrinthine corridors with an instinct he didn't know he possessed. Every turn, every new hallway, put more distance between them and the gilded cage that had almost become his tomb. After they had descended 2 flights of a rattling steel stairwell, he finally stopped, turning to face her in the dim, utilitarian light. The mask was gone. His face was pale, his eyes sharp and intense, boring into hers. "Talk!" he commanded, his voice raw, stripped of its corporate polish. Sarah's breath hitched. She leaned against the cool concrete wall, the trembling returning, no longer suppressed by adrenaline but released in its wake. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "I was in the side corridor and by the kitchen. 2 men. I didn't see their faces clearly, but they wore the same suits as your friends out there." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "They were talking about the toast, about the glass. One said it would be fast, that by the time anyone realized, you'd just be another headline about a stressed-out CEO with a heart condition." Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along his cheek. He remained silent, his stillness more terrifying than any outburst. He was processing, analyzing, connecting data points. "They mentioned a name," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength as the memory sharpened. "They called him Marcus's man. They said Marcus Vance had cleared the final transfer, that once the toast was made, it was all theirs." The name landed in the space between them like a physical blow. Marcus Vance, his CFO, his friend. The man who had been at his side since the company was nothing more than 2 servers in a garage. The man whose children Ethan knew by name. The betrayal was a poison far more potent than whatever was in that champagne glass. It spread through his veins, cold and paralyzing. He looked at this young woman, this complete stranger in a cheap uniform, whose name he didn't even know. This invisible girl who had just handed him back his life on a folded piece of paper. The entire glittering world he had built was a lie, a cruel stage for his own execution, and she was the only real thing in it. The elevator ascended in a profound, unnerving silence, a stark contrast to the frantic drumbeat of Sarah Miller's own heart. Each floor they passed was a number flashing in gold, pulling her further and further away from the world she knew, a world of linoleum floors and the constant clatter of dishes. When the doors whispered open, they did not reveal another corridor, but the living space of a penthouse so vast and sterile, it felt less like a home and more like a museum for the future. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering expanse of Manhattan, turning the city into a silent, sprawling tapestry of light. The air was cool and smelled of nothing, a controlled void that swallowed sound. Ethan Thorne did not speak. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, his footsteps making no sound on the polished dark wood floor. He shed his tuxedo jacket, tossing it onto a severe-looking leather sofa that probably cost more than Sarah's earnings for the entire year. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing forearms corded with tension. The man who commanded boardrooms and held the digital world in his palm now looked like a caged tiger, his brilliant mind racing behind eyes that were as cold and sharp as chipped ice. Sarah remained by the elevator, a ghost in her simple black and white uniform. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to stop the trembling that had taken root deep in her bones. This was a mistake. She should have run. Saving a billionaire was not in her job description. Protecting her sister Maya was, and every second she spent in this glass cage, she was putting Maya in a danger she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Water!" Ethan's voice cut through the silence, devoid of warmth. It wasn't an offer. It was a command disguised as a question. Sarah shook her head, unable to form words. Her throat was a desert. Ethan ignored her refusal, striding to a minimalist bar that seemed to emerge from a wall. He poured 2 glasses of water from a sleek silver pitcher, the clink of ice the only sound in the cavernous room. He placed one on a low-slung marble table in front of the sofa and held the other, studying her. "Sit down, miss." He paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Miller," she supplied, her voice a reedy whisper. "Sarah Miller." "Sit down, Sarah," he repeated, his tone unchanged. She obeyed, perching on the very edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, her worn-out work shoes looking like smudges on the flawless landscape of his wealth. The leather was cold against her legs. She stared at the glass of water but didn't touch it, her mind still screaming at the image of his champagne flute, the one she'd almost been too late to stop. Ethan Thorne did not sit. He began to pace, his movements a tight, controlled circuit in front of the wall of windows. "Tell me everything," he said. "Every word, every glance. Start from the beginning." And so, she did. At first, her words were hesitant, tripping over each other. She recounted walking through the service corridor, the brief moment she'd paused to adjust her apron. Then she described the voices, low, confident, seeping from a partially open door to a private pantry. One voice belonged to Marcus Vance, his chief operating officer, a man whose picture was often in the business journals. The other was deeper, belonging to a man she'd seen at Ethan's table, one of the board members. Her memory, honed by years of taking complex orders in noisy restaurants, had latched onto the fragments with chilling precision. Marcus said, "The dose is perfect. It will look like a coronary event by midnight," Sarah recounted, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor. The other man laughed. He said, "To the end of the boy king. The toast will be his final act." Then they talked about the glass, how it was separate from the others, how the bartender, a man named Leo, had been paid handsomely to ensure it was you, and only you, who received it. As she spoke, something shifted in the room. Ethan's pacing slowed, then stopped. He turned to face her fully, his analytical gaze sharpening, dissecting her every word, her every micro-expression. He was no longer just seeing a terrified waitress. He was processing data, and the data she was providing was precise, credible, and horrifying. "They mentioned a transfer," Sarah continued, her confidence growing as she lost herself in the memory. "Something about a Cayman account and a final wire clearing after the announcement of your death. They called it severance." Marcus Vance was looking at his watch. He said, "Another 30 minutes and Thorne Innovations will finally belong to the adults in the room." Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along his cheek. He walked to a large, dark screen on the wall and tapped it. A complex series of charts and financial data instantly appeared. His fingers flew across the screen, a blur of motion. He was cross-referencing her words with his company's most private records. For several long minutes, the only sound was the soft tapping of his fingers and Sarah's ragged breathing. Then he froze. "There," he breathed, his voice a low growl. He pointed to a series of outgoing wires, all coded under a project name she didn't recognize. "Sent to a shell corporation, the same one Vance set up 2 years ago for an acquisition that mysteriously fell through." He turned back to her, and for the first time the ice in his eyes had melted, replaced by the white-hot fire of betrayal. "Your memory is photographic." "I notice things," Sarah said simply. "It's my job. A stain on a glass, an empty water bottle, 2 men planning a murder. You learn to see what other people miss." In that moment, the chasm between them, the billionaire and the waitress, seemed to shrink. He saw not her uniform, but the sharp intelligence and quiet courage that lay beneath. He saw the person who had walked into the lion's den with nothing but a napkin and 4 scrawled words to protect him. He had built his empire on calculated risks, but Sarah Miller had just taken a risk that was anything but calculated. It was pure, instinctual, and it had saved his life. A new strategy began to form in his mind, sharp and clear. Hiding would solve nothing. Fleeing would be an admission of defeat. They would see him as weak and they would hunt him down. No, the men who tried to kill him operated in the shadows, comfortable in the darkness of backroom deals and whispered conspiracies. He would drag them into the light. "They want to erase me," Ethan said, his voice now steady, imbued with a cold, hard resolve. "They want to sit in my chair, run my company into the ground while they line their pockets, and tell the world I was a tragic genius who burned out too soon." He walked over to the table and finally picked up his own glass of water, taking a long swallow. He looked directly at Sarah. "I am not going to let that happen, and you are going to help me." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Help you? How? I told you everything. I have to go. My sister—" "Your sister is the reason you have to stay," Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting and precise. "These men, Sarah, they don't leave loose ends. Right now you are a loose end. The anonymous waitress who saw too much. Do you think they won't be looking for you? Do you think they won't turn that entire hotel upside down, trying to find the one person who could expose them?" The truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She thought of Maya, of her sweet, trusting face. She had acted to protect an innocent man, but in doing so she had painted a target on her own back, and by extension on Maya's. Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I'm going to call a press conference," Ethan declared, his eyes blazing with a strategic fire. "In 2 days, back in that same ballroom. I am going to invite the board, the investors, and the most influential financial journalists in the country. And I am going to burn Marcus Vance and his co-conspirators to the ground, publicly." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the vast room. "They will expect me to be in hiding. They will not expect me to stand on a stage and dismantle their entire world. But I can't do it alone. The financial records show their greed, but they don't prove attempted murder. You, Sarah, you are the proof. You are my witness." Sarah stared at him, horrified. "You want me to stand up in front of all those people and say what I heard?" "I want you to tell the truth," Ethan said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I know what I'm asking. It's more than anyone has a right to ask. But you have already shown more courage than my entire board of directors combined. You were brave enough to save my life in a room full of enemies. I'm just asking you to be brave one more time." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "They'll destroy me. My life, I have nothing." "You have your integrity," Ethan countered, his voice low and intense. "And that's more than any of them have. And you will not be alone. I will protect you. I will protect your sister. I give you my word." He extended a hand, not to shake, but as a simple, open gesture of alliance. "They tried to make me invisible tonight, Sarah, just another headline. It's what they do to people like you every single day. They make you invisible. Together we can show them just how much power an invisible person truly has." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of all the times she'd been overlooked, dismissed, treated as part of the furniture. She thought of the condescending smiles and the careless cruelty of the wealthy patrons she served every day. Then she thought of Maya, and the kind of world she wanted her sister to grow up in, a world where courage mattered, where doing the right thing wasn't punished. Her fear was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny ember of righteous anger began to glow. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her small, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, a silent promise in the heart of the glittering, dangerous city. The alliance was forged. High above the streets of Manhattan, the waitress and the billionaire began to plan their return to the ballroom, not as victim and server, but as partners in a high-stakes war for justice. The grand ballroom, the same gilded cage that had almost become Ethan Thorne's tomb, was now a courtroom of public opinion. The air, once thick with the scent of expensive perfume and celebratory champagne, was now sharp with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the electric crackle of a story about to break. 100 camera flashes pulsed in a relentless, silent storm, illuminating the strained faces of investors, board members, and the city's most voracious journalists. They had been summoned for an emergency press conference, and the palpable tension was a predator, coiling in the space between the crystal chandeliers and the marble floor. On the dais, Ethan Thorne stood, not as the triumphant CEO of 3 weeks prior, but as a man who had stared into the abyss and returned with its cold fire in his eyes. His suit was impeccably tailored, a dark grey armor, but his usual easy confidence was replaced by a somber, unshakable gravitas. To his right sat a team of lawyers, their faces grim and unreadable. To his left, the remaining board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mixture of confusion and anxiety. Among them, Marcus Vance, the company's CFO, wore a mask of concerned loyalty, but a slight tremor in his hand betrayed the lie. Beside him, Eleanor Vance, his wife and the head of marketing, adjusted her pearls with a gesture that was a fraction too sharp. They, along with 2 others, exchanged fleeting, nervous glances, believing this was merely a press conference to manage a minor financial scandal they themselves had orchestrated as a smokescreen. Ethan stepped to the microphone. The room fell into a profound hush, the only sound the faint whir of video cameras. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice calm, measured, and dangerously clear. It carried to every corner of the vast room. 3 weeks ago, we gathered in this very hall to celebrate a milestone for Thorne Innovations. We toasted to the future, to innovation, to a new era of success. He paused, letting the memory hang in the air. He saw Marcus and Eleanor relax almost imperceptibly, their smiles becoming a little more genuine. They thought he was setting the stage to announce a minor setback, a temporary dip in profits. "But a toast," Ethan continued, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing for a brief, searing moment on Marcus, "is a fragile thing. As fragile as trust, as fragile as a human life." A ripple of unease went through the audience. The journalists leaned forward, their instincts screaming that this was more than a financial report. Marcus Vance's smile froze on his face. Eleanor's hand flew to her necklace, her fingers tightening around the pearls. "For the past 2 years," Ethan's voice dropped, becoming colder, harder, "our sophisticated network of deceit has been operating from within the very heart of Thorne Innovations. A cancer. Millions of dollars have been siphoned through a web of offshore accounts and shell corporations meticulously designed to be untraceable." He gestured to a large screen behind him. It flickered to life, displaying a complex flowchart of encrypted transactions, account numbers, and routing codes that twisted across the screen like a digital serpent. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. This was no minor scandal. This was a corporate heist of epic proportions. "The evidence you see here," Ethan said, his voice like chipping ice, "was compiled over the past 3 weeks by a team of the world's best forensic accountants. It details every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature, every single stolen dollar." He pointed a remote and the screen zoomed in on a specific set of accounts, all linked to a single holding company in the Cayman Islands. A company registered under the name of Marcus Vance's deceased father. Marcus shot to his feet. "This is an outrage, an unsubstantiated, slanderous accusation," he sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Ethan didn't even flinch. He simply looked at Marcus, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Sit down, Marcus. We're not finished." The command was so absolute, so filled with cold authority, that Marcus sank back into his chair as if his legs had been cut from under him. Eleanor looked as if she had seen a ghost, her face a deathly white. But financial theft, as egregious as it is, was not their endgame. Ethan continued, turning back to the stunned audience. "When they learned that I was close to uncovering their scheme, that an internal audit was imminent, they decided on a more permanent solution." The room became so quiet that the sound of a single horrified breath was audible. "They decided," Ethan said, his voice now barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence, "to murder me, right here, in this room, with a glass of poisoned champagne." A collective, horrified gasp swept through the ballroom like a physical wave. The camera flashes intensified into a blinding, continuous strobe. The conspirators were no longer just white-collar criminals. They were monsters. Marcus Vance looked like he was about to be sick. Eleanor was openly trembling, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. Their plan was nearly flawless, Ethan went on, the memory of that night etched into his features. It would have worked. I would have raised that glass, taken a sip, and collapsed before I ever reached the end of my speech. A tragic, sudden heart attack, the coroner's report would have said, and they would have walked away with everything. He paused, letting the full horror of their plot sink in. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum of shock and revulsion. Then, Ethan's entire demeanor shifted. The cold fury in his eyes softened, replaced by something profound, something akin to reverence. His gaze left the terrified faces of his betrayers and scanned the edge of the room, past the rows of cameras and reporters, to a figure standing quietly near a service entrance. Sarah Miller stood in the shadows, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wore a simple, modest dress, a universe away from the couture gowns and bespoke suits that filled the hall. She was a ghost from another world, an invisible woman made manifest. When Ethan's eyes found hers, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and vindication. Their plan almost worked, Ethan repeated, his voice now ringing with a new emotion. It failed because of one person, someone they never saw, someone they never would have considered, because in their world of power and privilege, people like her are invisible. They are part of the scenery. They are meant to serve and be silent. He took a step away from the podium, his entire focus now on Sarah. 100 heads turned, following his gaze, a sea of confused faces trying to locate the object of his attention. That person is not a board member, not an executive, not a wealthy investor, Ethan declared, his voice swelling with power. Her name is Sarah Miller, and 3 weeks ago, she was a waitress at the celebration held in this room. He beckoned to her. "Sarah, please." Hesitantly, as if walking into a dream, Sarah stepped out of the shadows. A path parted for her as she walked towards the dais, the stunned silence broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. She felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare, but she kept her chin held high, her gaze fixed on Ethan. She ascended the small set of stairs, her modest dress a stark, defiant symbol of dignity against the backdrop of corporate opulence. Ethan met her at the top, offering a hand she didn't take, her own strength carrying her the final few feet. She stood beside him, trembling slightly but resolute. "This woman," Ethan announced, his voice filled with a gratitude so immense it seemed to shake him. Overheard a few whispered words in a service corridor. She had every reason to walk away, to protect herself, to remain invisible. But she didn't. She saw an injustice about to happen, and she chose to act. With nothing more than a cocktail napkin and 4 simple words, "Don't drink it. Go now." She saved my life. A low murmur of disbelief and awe rippled through the audience. They stared at Sarah, this unassuming young woman, and saw not a waitress, but a hero of impossible courage. "She risked everything," Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "For a stranger, for what was right. She is the embodiment of the integrity that these people," he gestured dismissively towards Marcus and the others, "tried to destroy." And then it happened. It started with a single journalist in the front row, a woman who had seen everything in her career, slowly getting to her feet and starting to clap. Then another person rose, and another. In a matter of seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The sound of applause began as a ripple and grew into a roaring, thunderous crescendo, a wave of respect and admiration that washed over Sarah, surrounding her, lifting her up. It wasn't polite applause. It was a visceral, emotional ovation for the unsung, for the unseen, for the quiet courage that existed in the places power never bothered to look. Sarah stood frozen, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek as the sound of 1,000 people celebrating her filled the magnificent hall. When the applause finally began to subside, Ethan raised his hand. There was one final piece. This event has exposed a deep sickness within our corporate culture, a culture that encourages silence and punishes honesty. That changes today, he announced. his voice ringing with conviction. He turned to Sarah, a look of profound respect on his face. That is why, effective immediately, Sarah Miller will no longer be a waitress. She will be joining the executive leadership of Thorne Innovations as the head of our newly formed and massively expanded corporate ethics and whistleblower protection program. She will have the authority, the resources, and my unwavering support to ensure that no voice in our company ever goes unheard again. The room erupted once more, this time in a stunned, joyous roar. It was more than a promotion. It was a revolution. It was the ultimate redemption. The invisible woman, the one they had all overlooked, was now one of the most powerful figures in the company, her very presence a testament to the fact that true value had nothing to do with a title or a bank account. As security officers moved in to apprehend a broken Marcus Vance and a sobbing Eleanor, Sarah Miller stood tall, no longer a ghost in the gilded cage, but its new, unshakable conscience. The toast had ended in near tragedy, but what happened in that ballroom that day was just the beginning of a new story, one forged not in profit, but in courage. The months that followed the night of the gala were not a quiet aftermath, but a controlled demolition. The gilded rot at the heart of Thorne Innovations was systematically exposed and excised, a painful but necessary surgery performed under the unflinching glare of public scrutiny. The process was relentless, marked by legal battles, boardroom purges, and the quiet, steady work of rebuilding trust from the ground up. At the center of this reconstruction was Sarah Miller. Her new office was on the 42nd floor, with a view of the city that still sometimes stole her breath away. It wasn't the corner office, not the opulent suite that Ethan occupied one floor above, but something far more important. It was accessible. The door, made of glass, was almost always open. Her title was Director of the Corporate Ethics and Whistleblower Protection Program, a position that hadn't existed 6 months ago. In practice, she was the company's conscience. Employees who had once navigated the polished hallways with their heads down, invisible and unheard, now found their way to her door. They came with whispers of discrepancies, with fears of retaliation, with the kind of small, brave truths that, left unheeded, fester into catastrophe. Sarah listened to them all. She remembered what it felt like to be a ghost in a uniform, to have a voice but no one to hear it. Her strength wasn't in wielding power, but in recognizing it in others. Her initial trepidation, the feeling of being an imposter in a world of tailored suits and Ivy League degrees, had been replaced by a quiet, fierce commitment. She navigated this new world, not by adopting its language of aggression and leverage, but by insisting on her own: clarity, empathy, and unwavering integrity. Ethan Thorne was a man remade. The ordeal had stripped him of his arrogance, replacing it with a sober gravitas. The boy genius who saw the world as a complex algorithm to be solved had been forced to confront the messy, unpredictable variable of human decency. He saw it most clearly in Sarah. He now ran his company not as a lone wolf, but as a partner. In meetings where his board once deferred to his every whim, he would now pause, turn his gaze to Sarah and ask, "Sarah, what are the ethical implications here? What are we not seeing?" He actively sought her counsel, not as a formality, but as a critical component of his decision-making. He had once built an empire on lines of code. Now he was rebuilding it on a foundation of character, with her as his architect. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of a shared crisis, had deepened into a bond that defied easy definition. It was more than professional respect, yet it wasn't a conventional romance. It was a rare and profound alignment of purpose. They spent long hours together, often late into the night, poring over policy drafts and restructuring plans. In those quiet moments, when the city lights glittered like a fallen constellation outside the panoramic windows, the corporate armor would fall away. They would talk about their lives before. His, a lonely climb from the ashes of a tragic childhood. Hers, a constant struggle to provide for the one person who mattered most. He learned about Maya's love for astronomy, her fierce intelligence, and the way her laughter could fill their tiny Brooklyn apartment. She learned about the crushing weight of his early success, the isolation that came with being on top, and the gnawing emptiness he had mistaken for ambition. One evening, while reviewing a particularly complex case, Sarah looked up from a file, her brow furrowed with concern. "This employee is terrified, Ethan. He saw something, but he's afraid of losing his job, his family's only source of income." Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. He didn't offer a quick, corporate solution. Instead, he said softly, "Then we make it impossible for him to be punished. We protect him so fiercely that his courage becomes an example, not a warning." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers. "You taught me that. You, with a folded napkin and 4 words. You risked everything." A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm they had crossed together. His hand, resting on the mahogany table, was only inches from hers. He had an urge, strong and sudden, to cover her hand with his, to feel the warmth and strength that he had come to rely on. But the moment was too fragile, their connection too sacred to be defined by a simple gesture. He simply held her gaze, letting the silence convey what words could not. That connection was most apparent on a golden afternoon in late spring, far from the steel and glass towers of their new reality. They were in Central Park, sitting on a wooden bench under the dappled shade of an ancient oak tree. The air was soft, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant sound of children's laughter. Between them sat Maya, her 9-year-old legs swinging freely, not quite reaching the ground. She was radiant, her bright eyes taking in the world with a clarity that often humbled them both. She had a sketchbook open on her lap, but for the moment she was looking from Sarah to Ethan, her head tilted in a way that signaled a profound thought was brewing. Sarah felt a sense of peace so complete it was almost startling. This was the life she had fought for, not the title or the office, but this, the safety to sit in a park on a sunny day, watching her sister smile without a cloud of worry hanging over them. Ethan, dressed in a simple grey t-shirt and jeans, looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. The hard lines of the CEO had softened, replaced by a gentle watchfulness as he observed Maya trying to capture the likeness of a squirrel in her sketchbook. Finally, Maya looked up, her gaze serious. "Sarah says you were in big trouble," she said to Ethan, her voice clear and direct. "And she saved you." Ethan smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that reached his eyes. "That's exactly right," he confirmed. "Your sister is the bravest person I have ever met." Maya considered this for a long moment, tapping her pencil against her chin. Her innocent logic was attempting to process a world of adult complexity, of betrayal and courage, of danger and salvation. She looked from Ethan's face, now open and kind, to Sarah's, filled with a quiet, protective love. Then she posed the question that had been forming in her mind, a question that cut through everything. "One day," she asked, her voice filled with sincere curiosity, "will everyone be brave?" The question hung in the warm air, simple and yet impossibly vast. It silenced the city's distant hum. Ethan's smile softened further. He didn't offer a platitude or an easy answer. He turned his head and looked at Sarah, a universe of gratitude, respect, and a dawning, deeper affection passing between them in that single glance. He was no longer just the man she had saved. She was the woman who had redefined his world. Her courage hadn't just saved his life, it had awakened his soul. He turned back to the little girl who represented the future they were trying to build. "Maybe not everyone, Maya," he replied softly, his voice gentle but laced with a newfound conviction. "But it only takes one brave voice to awaken all the others." His words settled over them, a quiet truth that was both a promise and a testament. On the bench, his hand and Sarah's rested inches apart, not touching, but connected by an invisible current of shared experience and mutual admiration. The sunlight streamed through the leaves, painting them in gold, and in that moment it was clear that the toast in the gilded ballroom had not been an ending. It had been a beginning, a terrifying, beautiful beginning to a story where the unseen were finally seen, the silenced were finally heard, and a single act of courage could ripple outward, changing everything.